You're listening to KYRS, Medical Lake in Spokane, 88.1 and 92.3 on your FM dial. Coming at you now, you've got Long Waves with Gary Krug. And thank you for joining us. Today we're going to talk about empires, inside and outside of empires. And we could use all kinds of things as a jumping off point today, but let's start with the thing everybody's talking about, the thing that's all over the news. It is the water cooler conversation of the week. The decisions out of Ferguson not to pursue charges against a police officer who shot a young black man in Ferguson, which raises a lot of concerns. It raises, again, though, an ongoing disconnect between our self-image and our reality, between who we think we are as a people and how we actually behave, between what we aspire to be, what Lincoln called the better angels of our nature, and what we actually end up behaving as. Now, people rush around, they go, well, it's this, it's that, it's the other thing, it's a lot of fatuous excuses they point to as if there was some sort of magic Band-Aid they could slather onto it and everything would be fine. But we're dealing with much bigger cultural issues here. Much bigger cultural issues, and the key one, the one that I want to return to today, is the issue of the social structure of empire. So we have a little understanding, maybe, of what empires look like out in the world, where a country exerts its influence using military power to control other countries for its own benefit. Nice, quick and dirty little explanation. But the thing we don't think about so much is what empires look like on the inside. They're not just like normal, happy countries. We can look at normal, happy countries, more or less, and what we see are countries with remarkably little racial violence. We see countries with a high standard of living, with good health care, with good educational systems, with a populace by and large that isn't crushed with debt. That's what normal, healthy countries should look like. But that's not the way the U.S. appears, and this has some other issues that it brings up for us. Empires have to manage the people inside of them. People have to know what's expected of them. People have to vote for the right things. They have to show up every 2 years in the U.S. and approve for the hand-picked slate of candidates who've been trotted out before us, and knowing full well that we're likely going to be betrayed by whoever is elected, who is going to act in the interests of power, who's going to act in the interest of militarism, who's going to act in the interests of wealth, and who's going to leave us high and dry. Who's going to leave us, once again, screwed. So how exactly do empires manage this? Well, there's a bunch of cute tricks they use. We talked about some of them last week. We'll be talking about more of them as we go along. But a key one is an appeal to nationalism, an appeal to fear, and an appeal to distraction. So if we think about nationalism for a moment, the nation state, the exceptional country, the country battling evil, the country doing good, Plato would have called these noble lies. These are the lies you tell people to get them to approve, or at least not disapprove too fervently, of whatever it is you have in mind, whatever kind of crazy thing you're going to go off in the world and do. Invade another country, torture people, kill people, shred the Constitution, whatever, just whatever. So if it's done in the name of nationalism, then it's all okay. And this nationalism then leads to a state of fear because because the country is so exceptional, because the people are so exceptional and noble and have so much freedom. Yeah, I had to clear my throat on that one. Because people have so much freedom inside the empire, there must be lots of evil folks in the world who envy the freedom, so the story goes. And so they're constantly trying to attack or kill or otherwise undermine. And if they're not outside, then there must be inside people. People who simply don't want to play the game, who would rather grift on the system than play the game and advance up the ranks. But even the dumbest person in this country is coming to the conclusion that the game is rigged. It always has been rigged, and it's increasingly rigged as you go. So there's all kinds of things to fear, not just the people outside, but also we see appeals to race. We see race division being promoted. It's subtle, but it's all around us, and sometimes it's not so subtle at all. We have the fear of being attacked. We have the fear of being increasingly unemployed, the fears of losing our houses, the fears of becoming homeless, the fears of becoming incarcerated, the fears of becoming another object of interest for the powers that be. So this is another form of control, which, if you think about, scared people are really very easy to control. You tell them there's some sort of threat, and what they have to do is this and this and this, and everything will be fine. Of course, it won't be, but it's an attempt to mollify the fear. And then I said distraction. Well, keep people distracted with bread and circuses, as the expression goes. So how can people possibly gain a cultural or social or historical understanding of their world when they're glued to Honey Boo Boo or those clowns with the ducks, or whatever the latest dog and pony show that's trotted out on the screen is about? And of course there are lots of fake scandals involving celebrities, involving politicians, and they're just trivia. They have no real impact on anything whatsoever, but they're distractions that take up the amount of time you have to take information in, to learn about things, and to discuss it. There's only so many hours in the day, and so much of it gets gobbled up in this way. So distraction, keeps the focus on these base impulses, sexuality, insecurity, ideas and diversions, thinking about material objects, cars, things you can get for your house. And these become fetish objects. These become very invested with a lot of emotional and sexual energy that people aren't quite sure what to do with. So people still talk about retail therapy, when in point of fact, study after study has showed that people who shop, the more people shop, the more depressed they feel. It's not therapy. It's just a way of sucking money out of your pocket. It's like Las Vegas, only instead of in a casino in Las Vegas, it's the shopping mall. Sucks the money out of your pocket, gives you a bunch of worthless junk, and makes you feel bad. I can't understand why more of us aren't doing it. So I said that empire is like a concerned, scared people. These are people who will act out the logic of empire. And the logic of empire is a lot like the logic of a domestic abuser. The cycles are the same. First, there's this kind of honeymoon period where, everything is just better than it could possibly be. We're going to have hope and change. We're going to have a brave new world. We're going to have more freedoms. We're going to have more whatever. We're the greatest country that ever, whatever, blah, 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 blah. You know the drill. Then you have an escalation of threats and violence, and we've got to get inside your computers. We've got to monitor all your phone calls. We've got to read your mail. This escalation. And then comes a kind of, then comes a kind of social violence where people are punished. Where people are punished economically, where people are punished psychologically, where people are punished in the criminal justice so-called system. And then a lot of blame and, oh, you see what a bad person this is. You hold them up as an example. Everybody can look down at it. And then the pattern starts all over again. And this pattern's repeated endlessly in the news cycles, repeated endlessly in the logic of the culture that we see played out all around us. It's just craziness. It's madness. But it's a kind of madness that's required to maintain an empire. How else do you get people to make decisions that harm them and others? Decisions that if they thought for 5 seconds about it, they wouldn't make at all. Decisions like torture. Decisions like bombing civilians. Decisions like eternal wars that bankrupt the country and go nowhere. People wouldn't do that, right? They'd go, no, that sounds crazy. And it is. It's crazy as it can be. So what are we supposed to be afraid of this week? Well, there's ever-present ISIS, or ISIL, or IS, or Daesh, as the Arabs like to call it. And, you know, these guys are handy because they're the always changing threat. And if we get tired of ISIS, we can always pull out another group, and al-Nusra or Free Syrian Army or Al-Qaeda in Iraq or whomever. But ISIS is the current belle of the ball, so to speak. And so this is the one we're all supposed to be afraid of. But we can't, as a country, we can't, as a propaganda meme, think of exactly how to think of ISIS. So, I mean, on the one hand, it's this truly, truly evil monster, or as Tom Engelhardt once put it, the Islamic State was being portrayed as a monster movement engorging itself on the region, one that potentially imperiled just about every American interest on the planet. And you remember this, right? You remember when this is how we talked about ISIS, and it still appears this way on the news from time to time. And we see the beheading pictures, and oh, this is awful. And it's curious, you know, we saw the beheading pictures from ISIS, and it was like, oh, look at these monsters. And the same week, Saudi Arabia executed some 40 some odd people, also by beheading. They just didn't post the pictures on YouTube, or I didn't see them. And somehow that didn't get any notice, but ISIS, look at these awful people. So anyway, there is a general by the name of Dempsey, and Mr. Dempsey, General Dempsey, rushed off to a surprise visit to Baghdad. You know, the kind of thing like they do in every war. They rush off and they survey the situation, and they come back and talk about the great progress we're making. Anyway, Dempsey came back and he suddenly insisted, I'm quoting now from Tom Engelhardt's article, he suddenly insisted that the monster was faltering, that the momentum of battle in Iraq was starting to turn. He then labeled the militants of the Islamic State as a bunch of midgets running around with a really radical ideology, and concluded that, despite the nature of those formerly giant, now puny fellows and the changing momentum of war, it might nonetheless take years to win. On his return to Washington, he became more specific, claiming that the war could last up to 4 years, and adding, "This is my third shot at Iraq. That's probably a poor choice of words." So, you know, which is it? Are they incompetent, or are they ruthless threats who are going to take over the whole of the Middle East? Well, what they are is convenient. They're extremely convenient, because ISIS allows the American media, the American propaganda machine, to play the race card again, the race and race religion card again. So there's an easy way to divide people into the good folk and the bad folk. And we've seen this card played from the very beginning. This country is founded on racism. This country is founded on genocide. This country is founded on theft. And it's something we've never gotten our heads around. But let's just think about immigration for a minute. So, every time there was a wave of new immigrants to the U.S., almost inevitably, whoever was already here hated them. Whether it was the Irish, the Poles, and the Italians, or the Germans, this country was never a melting pot. This country was always, 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 always racially riven and divided. And this is especially true in empires, and it's become more intense as the nation has become more imperial, because empires as a kind of national idea inevitably fall onto this racial or cultural mythology. So there are these great people who are Americans, whatever that is, and everybody else is evil or at least second class. There are these great people, the Germans. There are these great people, the Italians, and everybody else. So we get these ethnic and racial divisions that seed hatred, seed division, and it makes people very easy to play off against each other. You know, you just tell the Irish that the Italians are coming and they're going to move into your neighborhoods and ruin everything, or you tell the Italians that the Poles are coming, and so we can always use race as a difference, right? Race is a way of dividing people, and it's amazing that all of this happens without much in the way of self-awareness or self-consciousness on the part of the people who feel all this hate. And there's not much self-consciousness of why they are filled with rage and anger and hatred and all of these unconscious projections against these people who, except for very minor details and a few accidents of birth, are remarkably similar to themselves. But this never occurs to them. Right? This never happens. So there's a lot of acting out. We see self-medications of various kinds, alcohol, drug abuse. We see violence. We see hatred. We see vicious attacks on people for no reason whatsoever, all without any self-awareness. So whatever goes on outside the empire, outside of the country, the same occurs inside the country. If we're using race to attack people overseas, that race hate is going to get turned back around inside the country. If we're using religious intolerance to attack people overseas, that same religious intolerance is going to get played out internally. As outside, so inside. You have two choices. You are a vassal or you are an enemy. You are a vassal or you are an enemy. You're either obeying the orders or you're to be killed or fought or removed. Within this, self-determination is completely ruled out, inside and outside the empire. Right? You're not allowed to decide that your race is the good one. You're not allowed to decide that your race has nothing to do with who you are. It's already in place. Migrants, surveillance. What this all then amounts to is a kind of trauma on people as they become poor, as they become attacked for their race, as they become marginalized in society for any one of a number of reasons. There was a very interesting bit of news on this topic by Lynn Stewart Paramore on Alternet called So Many People Are Badly Traumatized by Life in America. And I'll just read a little bit of this. A 2012 study of hospital patients in Atlanta's inner-city communities showed that rates of post-traumatic stress are now on a par with those of veterans returning from war zones. At least 1 out of 3 surveyed said they had experienced stress responses like flashbacks, persistent fear, a sense of alienation, and aggressive behavior. In inner-city communities, 1 of 3 are showing symptoms of PTSD. Quote, all across the country, in Detroit, New Orleans, and in what historian Louis Fergler describes as economic dead zones, places where people have simply given up and sunk into involuntary idleness, The pain is written on slumped bodies and faces that have become masks of despair. We're starting to break down. When our alarm systems, I'm continuing the quote, when our alarm systems are set off too often, they start to malfunction. It's easy. We end up in a state of hypervigilance, unable to properly assess the threats. It's easy for the powerful to manipulate this tense condition and present an array of boogeymen to distract our attention, from immigrants to the unemployed, so that we focus our energy on the wrong enemy. Guns give us a false sense of control, and hatred of those who don't look like us channels our impotent rage. Trauma. She continues further on in the piece. Trauma is not just about experiencing wars and sexual violence, though there is plenty of that. Psychology researchers discuss trauma as something intense that happens in your life that you can't adequately respond to, and which causes you long-lasting negative effects. It's something that leaves you fixated and stuck, acting out your unresolved feelings over and over and over. And the cycle just continues. I mean, trauma is the gift that keeps on giving. It ends up in our genes. It ends up in our psyches. It ends up being taught to our children. And she makes an important point here. Trauma occupies a space, she writes. Trauma occupies a space much bigger than our individual neurons. It's political. If your parents lost their jobs, their home, their sense of security in the wake of a financial crisis, you will carry those wounds with you, even if conditions improve. Now, for those of you who are old enough that you know people who grew up in the Great Depression, that was a trauma that never left them, that influenced their behavior, their thinking, their values for the rest of their lives. Let's just look at a couple of other points here. Over 2.7 million children have a parent in lockup, which is considered traumatic by the Centers for Disease Control. These children have a parent in stir. They're twice as likely to develop mental illness than other children. And they are more likely to experience asthma, obesity, and trouble in school. We find that unemployment is increasingly linked to suicide, the 10th leading cause of death in the U.S. Here's one that blows me away. Up to 15% of adults in the U.S. over 60 exhibit PTSD symptoms, post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms. 15% of adults over 60. Homelessness among the elderly is increasing and is expected to leap 33% by 2020. Rates of economic hardship among elderly women in particular have leapt in recent years. Up to 18% live in extreme poverty, and that number is expected to rise. Anguish, helplessness, loss, trauma, pain. People act it out, and they can't get away from it. I just can't do it. So, what then is, let's put a different twist on this. Let's think about who these young men in ISIS really are. Basically, they're traumatized young men with no hope. These are young men between the ages of 15 and 30. Most of them are probably in their late teens, early 20s. They may come from European countries. They're certainly among the displaced Sunni who are unemployed, who are traumatized, who have been culturally humiliated again and again and again by foreign powers, the British, the French, the Americans, everyone, who see their homes blown up, who see their families killed, who understand this as a way of life, who have no future, no jobs, no hope for a future, no power. They have no self-determination. It's pretty easy in that situation to find an enemy, see who happens to be the current power in the country, blowing stuff up and stealing your wealth, stealing your resources. So attack them. This is not terribly different from the kinds of rage that we're beginning to see well, that we see all the time in the U.S., these guys are just better organized. I mean, that really is the difference. They're better organized. And really, they have even less to lose. So why not go out in a blaze of glory? Why not go out attacking the infidel invader? So as outside the empire, so things are inside the empire. So let's look outside again. Where have the U.S. loves to talk about extending the zone of freedom, fighting for democracy, fighting to liberate people, fighting to raise people up and bring them into the brave new world. Sounds remarkably like Rudyard Kipling's White Man's Burden, doesn't it? Well, let's think about some of the outstanding jobs that we've done. Everybody likes to hold up World War II. Okay, World War II. We fought the Nazis, blah, 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 and the Japanese, blah, blah, blah. But we forced the Japanese into a war. That's for another show. And the Nazis were going to have to be fought anyway, but they could have been dealt with much earlier and much more easily. But that wasn't going to happen for a variety of reasons, one of which was there were a lot of people in the U.S. who like the Nazis, who liked the Nazi Party in Germany. Henry Ford, for one of them. Charles Lindbergh, the American aviator who flew across the Atlantic, big fan of the Nazis. Anyway, continuing along, let's look at some of these, the marvelous examples of the freedoms that we haven't brought. We could think about Arbenz in Guatemala, who was deposed by a violent U.S. coup. Why? Because he wanted to take land that was owned by American fruit companies and give it, even though that land wasn't being used for anything, and give it to poor farmers so they could have a subsistence existence and maybe even make a bit of money. Sounds like communism to me. Let's kill him. Let's install a ruthless military dictatorship that will give the fruit companies carte blanche. We could talk about Mossadegh in Iran in 1953, who, oh my heavens, demanded to see the ledgers on how much oil the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company was pulling out. And they refused to provide it. He was trying to negotiate a better deal for his country, and no one wanted to negotiate with him. So he said, great, and Parliament approved a nationalization of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which prompted the Brits to go whine to the CIA, and the CIA popped over and eliminated Mossadegh through a coup. He was subsequently tried by the ruthless dictator we installed. Interesting sidelight here. The CIA person who ran the operation was the grandson of Theodore Roosevelt, a gentleman by the name of Kermit Roosevelt. Anyway, so from 1953 to 1979, Iran was run by a ruthless dictator with a ruthless internal security apparatus trained and established by the CIA called SAVAK. And they eliminated all political opposition and kept Iran safe for the oil companies. And in 1979, the Iranians rose up, reclaimed their country, seized the U.S. Embassy looking for some evidence of these sorts of things. But since 1979, America, and a lot of Americans have hated them ever since. Does anybody even know why? People who are so concerned about Iran, do they even know why they think they're concerned? We could talk about Allende in Chile. Again, removed by a CIA coup with the aid of the military. The ruthless dictator Augusto Pinochet was installed. Again, ruthless repression of real democracy. Everywhere it springs up. That seems to be what we do best. Chile had 41 years of successful democratic government, but they made some decisions that upset the big American companies, AT&T and Anaconda Copper and people like that. And oh golly gosh, can't you please make them quit and give us our stupid enormous profits so we can have them forever and ever and ever. 41 years of democracy snuffed out. So, well, let's look at our more recent track record. Afghanistan, well, that's going swimmingly, isn't it? And now we're extending the deadline. We're going to have troops in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Iraq. We're back in Iraq. This is the third time we're back in Iraq. Really? Seriously? And this is going to work any better? Or Syria? Do we even know what we're doing with Syria now? Assad seems to be the only ally we have in that region, although we keep supporting al-Nusra, or a part of al-Nusra, which is also apparently a part of al-Qaeda. You need a scorecard to keep up with the players. You truly do. But let's look for a moment at an example of a state that played along with the U.S. That sang the company's song, that was kind to the oil companies, gave them everything they want. And, there hasn't been a coup yet. And probably won't be as long as they can keep things handled internally. I'm speaking, perhaps not surprisingly, of Mexico. Mexico, the country to our south. The one on the other side of Texas, the one that half of the Texas school kids couldn't identify. Anyway, they have a presidente, called Peña Nieto, who took power. And one of the first things he did, one of the reasons he got elected was because the oil companies the international oil companies very much wanted access to all that Mexican shale oil and all that Mexican offshore oil, which up to that time was the province of the Mexican National Oil Company. So he said, no problem. We'll make that happen. He brought in an extreme right conservative government. He opened the oil fields to international competition, and the U.S. just loves it. But what we have witnessed as well is a growing, massive human rights scandal and human rights violations on an enormous scale in Mexico. I don't know if you've been following the story. They're trying to find the 24 students who disappeared, meaning they were picked up and murdered and buried somewhere. And it seems like every time they turn around, they find another mass grave. Right? Since Peña Nieto took power, the U.S. government has not issued a single condemnation of corruption or human rights violations in Mexico. Not one. Not one. Quoting John Ackerman, writing for Al Jazeera here, this in a context in which leading international organizations such as Human Rights Watch, Article 19, and dozens of local NGOs have documented a scandalous increase in the repression of protest and violence against the press during the present administration. The muted response by the U.S. government to the September 26th student massacre, this is last September, is part of a broader trend of looking the other way. But, of course, Congress has lots of money to pour into a war, in this case a drug war. So Congress has appropriated billions of dollars to fund the Mexican government's security apparatus. Mexican and U.S. authorities set up elite fusion centers throughout the country for sharing intelligence information. The Wall Street Journal just revealed that U.S. agents dress up in the uniforms of Mexican military personnel to participate directly. Then we had, on November 20th, just this month, we had huge protests, including a burning of an effigy of Nieto in Mexico City, in Zocalo Square. And the crackdown was pretty severe. Quote again. According to multiple witnesses, during the enormous protest of November 20th in Mexico City, masked provocateurs firebombed police and then stood by and watched as authorities indiscriminately manhandled journalists and human rights observers and detained innocent students. Nieto immediately accused 11 students of serious federal crimes such as terrorism, organized crime, and conspiracy, and had them locked up in high-security prisons hundreds of miles from the capital. So could we see another dirty war? Could we see another dirty war down in Mexico, the way we saw in Honduras, the way we saw in Costa Rica? or the way we saw in Nicaragua? Yeah, certainly we could. Certainly we could. Right across our border. Repression of democracy by force, repression of opposition groups by force, repression of protest by force, by murder, by extermination. Why not? Sounds good, That's the sort of thing that works and the sort of thing that, the U.S. is very good at. And this is exactly the sort of tactic we used against the Taliban. This is the sort of tactics that were used in Iraq. And every time we knock over a country and put in our person, we end up with this. We adopt this as a strategy. Underlying it all is this hubris of regime change, that the U.S. is somehow alone entitled to go around and change governments that it doesn't like. We call it regime change. Military coups would be another way to think of it. So, who are we to even talk about removing Syria? Who are we to even talk about removing Iran, removing the government? In a country that locks up more people per capita than any other country on the planet, we're the ones who are going to talk about freedom? In a country with some of the greatest economic inequality in the industrial world, and a crumbling infrastructure, and a crumbling medical system, we're going to talk about freedom and how everybody would like to be like us? Really? What a great idea. I'm sure everybody's just sitting around with bated breath, waiting to hear more glorious stories of the People's Republic of America. The United States of America. And so the latest bit of this hubris involves a rather more dangerous escalation, and this is the escalation of poking a stick at the Russian bear. Okay. I think everybody out here who's listening knows that if you poke a bear with a stick, the bear's going to react, and probably not pleasantly. So we've been poking at the Russian bear with our stance on Ukraine, with supporting a coup to overthrow a democratically elected government in Ukraine, with sanctions, economic sanctions against the Russian people, with military operations on Russia's borders, with the extension of NATO and into Latvia and Estonia. So, poking at the Russian bear. And there's been this enormous flap of sometimes laughable news reports. I think Lithuania just recently reported that a Russian submarine was detected 27 miles from their coastal waters. Talk about a non-story. And just a week or so ago, Sweden reported a Russian submarine, but there was no evidence of a Russian submarine. There were no pictures. They couldn't find it, blah, 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 blah. But that's not what people remember. People remember, oh, there was a Russian submarine. People remember, oh, this awful thing happened, even if it didn't. The mere fact that somebody said that it happened, makes it seem that it really did. That's what people remember. So the latest bit, for those of you who followed the G20 clown show, is the idea that somehow we're isolating Russia. Russia is a pariah. Russia is not part of civilized countries. So Moon of Alabama website put together a little list here. India Times. Barack Obama says Russia will remain isolated if it continues to destabilize Ukraine. Yahoo News. Cameron warns Russia of isolation and further sanctions. LA Times. Putin faces isolation at G20 conference. New York Times. Putin gets a cool reception from G20. Vice News. World leaders snub Putin at G20. Exile him to social Siberia. Reuters. G20 commits to higher growth, fight climate change. Russia isolated over Ukraine. And The Guardian. Isolated Putin leaves G20 summit. Oh, he does sound like just a bad person who shouldn't be allowed to play with the other kids, doesn't he? German Prime News show Tagesschau even showed a picture of Putin apparently sitting alone at a lunch table to prove his isolation. But he's actually sitting with the Brazilian president, Dilma Rousseff, and waiting for another lunch guest to join them. They just weren't there because Tagesschau selectively framed the picture to cut them out. So, Moon of Alabama rightly raised the question, do the people who do these kinds of games actually know what the 20 and G20 is about? Who are the people who actually snubbed Putin, who were rude to him? Well, let's count them. Obama, 1. Cameron, 2. Harper, 3. Abbott, 4. Abe, 5. Well, that leaves 15 leaders who didn't snub Putin, doesn't it? And that would be Argentina, Brazil, China, France, Germany, India, Indonesia, Italy, Mexico, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, the Republic of Korea, and Turkey. Merkel had a 3-hour talk with Putin. And it's interesting, Putin pointed out before the G20 meeting, the combined GDP of the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, the combined GDP of the BRICS countries calculated using their purchasing power parity is already bigger than that of the so-called G7 countries. Quoting Putin again, as far as I know, the BRICS countries have more than 37 trillion calculated using purchasing power parity, while the G7 has 34.5 trillion. And this upward trend in favor of the BRICS, it's not vice versa. So, but Putin's the bad guy, right? And we've got to isolate him, and the world's isolating him. And that's how the story plays. And it plays with Americans, again, because we have this culture of abuse. Somebody doesn't like you, you slap them around. You get tough. Right? The logic of abuse continues inside and outside. There's no getting away from it. The interesting bit about all of this was the foreign minister, Lavrov of Russia, had some very interesting comments just quite recently on this topic. And let me just read you a little bit of what Lavrov had to say, because it got remarkably little coverage in the U.S. It is indeed dangerous when decisions on key problems of the development of the world and humankind as a whole are taken on the basis of short electoral cycles. In the United States, the cycle is 2 years, and each time one has to think of or do something to win votes. This is the negative side of the democratic process, but we cannot afford to ignore it. We accept the logic when we are told to resign, relax, and take it as a given that everyone has to suffer just because there are elections in the United States every 2 years. This is just not right. We will not resign ourselves to this because the stakes are too high in the fight against terror. The threats of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, many bloody conflicts whose negative impact goes far beyond the framework of the corresponding states and regions. The wish to do something to gain unilateral advantages or to endear oneself to the electorate ahead of another election leads to chaos and confusion. We often hear the daily repeated mantra that Washington is aware of its own exclusiveness, its duty to bear this burden to lead the rest of the world. Rudyard Kipling spoke about the white man's burden. I hope this is not what drives Americans. The world today is not white or black, but multicolored and heterogeneous. Leadership in this world can be assured not by persuading oneself of one's exclusiveness and God-given duty to be responsible for everyone, but only by the ability and craft in forming a consensus. If the U.S. partners committed themselves to this goal, this would be priceless, and Russia would be actively helping them. Russia would be actively helping them. So is this us slapping around the other countries? Why are we upset with Russia anyway? Well, we're upset with Russia because of Ukraine. Why are we upset with Russia over the Ukraine? Let's see. The U.S. and some of the EU countries have been trying to pull Ukraine into the European Union, into the European sphere of influence, European laws, playing by European rules, working with the IMF and the World Bank and all like this. Well, not everybody in the Ukraine is completely happy about this. and haven't been happy about this. And this has led to a very unstable situation over there, where one president was removed, Viktor Yanukovych, and then he was reelected as prime minister, and then he was removed, and then he came back as president. And then in 2014, we had just this year and last year, we had the Euromaidan protests, the riots, where neo-Nazi muscle was beating people, was shooting people, was storming into TV stations. Riots that were presented as if it's just an uprising of people in internal politics. Actually, a great deal of this was coordinated from overseas. The original uprising in 2004, that bunch, was actually organized and encouraged by the U.S. State Department, by the USAID, by the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs. Isn't that a lovely name? The National Democratic Institute for International Affairs. Put that on a business card. A bunch of other NGOs, and undoubtedly the CIA. But here was the bit. Yanukovych broke off the talks with the EU and instead pursued negotiations with Russia. Now, this is an unforgivable sin. He had to go. So, with neo-Nazi muscle, with encouragement from the outside, with assistance from American provocateurs, with the guidance of our Secretary for European Affairs, Victoria Nuland, and our ambassador in Ukraine, Pyatt, another coup was pulled. November 27th, 2013, and this just came out this year, anonymous Ukraine hackers released a series of emails from a Lithuanian government advisor to opposition leader and former boxer Vitaly Klitschko regarding plans to destabilize Ukraine. For example, quote, "Our American friends promise to pay a visit in the coming days. We may even see Nuland or someone from the Congress." That would have been John McCain. On the 12th, he writes, there was the message, "Your colleague has arrived. His services may be required even after the country is destabilized." On the 14th, "I think we've paved the way for more radical escalation of the situation. Isn't it time to proceed with more decisive action?" We had well-orchestrated protesters already in the streets of Kiev. And then we had this was in November of 2013, and European Commissioner President José Manuel Barroso announced that the EU would not accept Russia's veto of the agreement, would not accept, there was no agreement, but would not accept that Russia didn't like it or that Ukraine wasn't going to do it. Nuland even, talk about being obvious about your involvement. Assistant U.S. Secretary of State for Europe and Eurasia, Victoria Nuland, proudly told a meeting of the International Business Conference, sponsored by U.S. Ukrainian Foundation, that the U.S. had invested more than $5 billion and 5 years' worth of hard work and preparation in achieving what she called Ukraine's European aspirations. She also apparently made it extremely clear to Yanukovych that the U.S. required, quote, immediate steps to get back into the conversation with Europe. So here we have involvement. Here we have the smoking gun. I mean, these people are trying to set up an agreement that they would like, that would work for them, an agreement that would basically require Ukraine to dissolve its pensions, just pretend it never promised to give people their pensions. So dissolve that debt, and then they could get money from the IMF. Well, we've seen this game before, haven't we? How did that work out in Greece? How did that work out in Spain? How did that work out in Ireland? Not very well at all, actually. It crashed the countries. It sent them into hideous economic spirals, and they're still not getting better. And the EU has simply not got more money to pour into these things. There's no more money left. So, if you want to know what a coup looks like, study what's going on in the Ukraine. You know, it's amazing. Just read you a bit more of this. And this is from Counterpunch. So just reading along here. While Western media have portrayed Yanukovych as a weak leader, Nuland's depiction of a tough meeting can only mean he resisted her threats and intimidations. In what must have been a touching moment, Nuland spoke about a show of force by the government police on demonstrators who sang hymns and prayed for peace. What Nuland did not reveal on December 13th was that her meetings with key Ukrainian stakeholders included neo-Nazi Svoboda Party leader Tynybok and Prime Minister wannabe Arseniy Yatsenyuk of the Fatherland Party. At about the same time Nuland was wooing fascist extremists, Senator John McCain and Senator Chris Murphy shared the stage in Kiev with Tynybok, offering their support in opposition to the sitting government. So we have U.S. senators offering support and opposition to a sitting government, to a neo-Nazi party leader, a Svoboda party leader, in public. The Svoboda Party has roots with extreme vigilante and anti-Semitic groups. It has received at least 3 high-level cabinet posts in the interim government, including deputy prime minister. There is no doubt that the progenies of West Ukraine's historic neo-fascist thugs that fought with Hitler are now aligned with the U.S., represented by Victoria Nuland. So, and for those of you who really love Joe Biden, he had a hand in this too. He gave an attaboy call to Yatsenyuk back in March of 2014, reaffirming the U.S. support for Ukraine's territorial integrity. And Kerry said, we have the president. Kerry said, you'll love this. You don't just behave by invading another country on completely trumped-up pretext. Suggesting that somehow Russia was going to move in and, take Ukraine. And we hear all this breathless talk about, Russian troops are moving in. No evidence. Not even a photo, of course. But, Kerry, who supported the 2003 invasion of Iraq, is deeply concerned about, the Russians. The President Obama's comments. Countries have deep concerns and suspicions about this kind of meddling. And he goes on, as long as none of us are inside Ukraine trying to meddle and intervene with decisions that properly belong to the Ukrainian people. And then he announced a $1 billion aid package to Ukraine. And it is odd that they couldn't actually come up with a $1 billion aid package for Detroit or Atlanta. Or didn't I not hear on the radio today that Pensacola, Florida owes $1 billion in pensions? But, let's give some money to the Ukraine because, gosh, hey, you never know. Inside and out, empires are the same. And this was observed a long time ago, 1919, by Josef Schumpeter, a German sociologist, who wrote a fascinating book on empire called Empires. It's well worth a read. You can find it online. I can put a link on the Facebook page of the show if you want to check there. And I'll just quote a couple of passages here from Schumpeter's book. He's referring to Disraeli taking government in England, and the argument that Disraeli used. The main thing, quote now, the main thing before which all argument stemming from calculating self-interest must recede into the background was the unfailing power of the appeal to national sentiment. No other appeal is as effective except at a time when the people happen to be caught in the midst of a flaming social struggle. All other appeals are rooted in interests that must be grasped by reason. This one alone arouses the dark powers of the subconscious, calls into play instincts that carry over from the life habits of the dim past. Driven out everywhere else, the irrational seeks refuge in nationalism, the irrational which consists of belligerence, the need to hate, a goodly quota of inchoate idealism, the most naive and therefore the most unrestrained egotism. This is precisely what constitutes the impact of nationalism. It satisfies the need for surrender to a concrete and familiar superpersonal cause, the need for self-glorification and violent self-assertion. Whenever a vacuum arises in the mind of a people, as happens especially after exhausting social agitation or after a war, this nationalist element comes to the fore. This, too, is our trauma personally, our trauma nationally. And this explains a great deal of why we have Ferguson, why we let old people die, why we neglect our veterans, why we neglect the least among us, why we ridicule and imprison people who try to reach out to help others or to change. This, too, is our trauma, and we end up as bullies. We end up as racists. We end up as thugs. Because we have, as Schumpeter said, the need for surrender to a concrete and familiar superpersonal cause, the need for self-glorification and violent self-assertion. That's going to wrap up today's show. I'd like to thank all of you for listening in. I'll be back next week at 3 o'clock here on KYRS. And I'll just say it again. You are listening to KYRS, Medical Lake, Spokane, 88.1 and 92.3 FM. You can write me, email me. That's longwaves@kyrs.org. Or you can follow us on the Facebook page. And the Facebook page for this show is Long Waves Radio. Long Waves Radio. And I'll put on some materials about the show from time to time, as well as some of the articles. And you can text me there, and I'll try to respond to those as soon as I can get to them. So again, thank you for listening. Until next week, I'm going to leave you at goodbye.